Hi, and welcome. You're listening to the X22 Report Spotlight, and today's guest is James Corbett. He runs the site Corbett Report. He has a YouTube channel called Corbett Report. He also has done some videos, the 9/11 conspiracy theory, the Oklahoma City, a conspiracy theory, and Century of Enslavement, history of the Federal Reserve. Welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight, James Corbett.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for being on, and a lot of people have been asking for you. Let me start off with a question that everyone has been throwing at me. The AIIB and the central bank, the Fed, and how does this play out with China, the United States? Where are they going with all this?
That's really one of the most important geopolitical, economic, social, political questions that we can think of at this time, I think, because we're being positioned right now into the conflict of the 21st century, which I see, broadly speaking, as U.S. allies, NATO allies, proxies, versus the Eastern Bloc, China, Russia, that sort of engineered conflict is being brought about right now. And one aspect of this is what we're seeing with these, I think, this chess piece moving back and forth on the chessboard right now between the institutions that came out of the World War II and the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, versus these new upstarts like the BRICS were proposing their new development bank, which they formalized last year, although they haven't made much, if any, progress on that yet. And now, of course, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which China has just scrabbled together, including many of America's erstwhile allies who are now joining as founding members of AIIB, despite America's disapproval or seeming disapproval of this. So we are getting the impression, at any rate, that what we have are the two competing sides of this global superpower fight, and they're trying to compete for slices of the pie, as it were. And that makes sense, I think, to everyone on a basic fundamental level. That's the way history has always unfolded. There's always been competing powers and rival powers fighting for slices of the pie of the global system generally. And now here we are with the U.S. unipolar world where we've had Pax Americana for the past 60, 70 years enforced at the barrel of a gun. And now it looks like these new upstarts are coming along through this, rise of the BRICS countries over the past decade and a half, and the incredible growth, the economic growth of China, to really challenge that structure. I see it quite differently. I think that, in fact, what we're being prepared for is basically a jumping of the ship of the oligarchy that has ensconced itself in America for the past half century, that previously ensconced itself in England, before that ensconced itself in Venice and other places. I mean, it's an oligarchy that I don't think really cares what particular country it's inhabiting. And I think there's every indication that they are preparing to inhabit China as the next vehicle through which they can continue to perpetuate their oligarchy, but this time in a global system, a truly global system. And I think that is a very subtle and very menacing development, because a lot of people will be tricked into thinking the AIIB, the New Development Bank, these types of institutions are going to be the answer to the obvious economic hardships that have been brought about by the IMF and the World Bank and the Washington Consensus hegemony. Unfortunately, if I am correct in this thesis, then, and there's a lot of detail that goes into this, and I talked about this in a podcast called China and the New World Order that people can look up on my website. But if I'm correct in my thesis, then the support for these New Development Bank and AIIB and these types of institutions is in fact only supporting the further aggrandizement of the same oligarchical clique that controls both sides of this phony war.
So what you're saying is, are they doing this because the system here that we have now, the dollar system that they set up, is failing? Is this why they're moving everything out to China at this time?
I think that puts the cart before the horse. I think that they are now de-engineering the dollar. They are engineering the death of the dollar specifically to bring about the new system. Because, of course, Pax Americana achieved what it achieved for the growth of the oligarchy and the growth of their financial interests over the past half century to a century quite well. But that era is really coming to an end for a lot of different reasons. And I think as a result of that, we're starting to see the ultimate plundering of whatever is left of the American economy and its associated allied economies in the Western world. So we're seeing basically this ridiculous transfer of wealth right now to the very, very top. Not the 1%, the 0.001% are really sucking off the wealth of the entire world at this point through the back door, through all of the financial chicanery that we've seen, especially kicking into overdrive since the 2008 Lehman collapse. So I think that what's happening right now, it really is the pulling of the plug on the world economic system that has underpinned the global economy since, say, Bretton Woods, with the US dollar as the world reserve. We're seeing that plug being pulled, but I don't think the oligarchy is shooting themselves in the head. They're not that stupid. I think they're already planning. Obviously, if you want to bring about a new world structure, you have to take out the old world structure. And that's exactly what's happening. It's being done, I think, on the highest level. I think it's being done with malice aforethought. At the lower levels, I'm sure there are people who are going to be caught up in this. The lower middle gopher levels, there are going to be people who are caught up in this who are going to end up with holding the bag and are not going to come out well in this. But I think, again, at the very, very top of this pyramid, I think the people who have controlled this world system for the past half century are not just suddenly letting go of it. And I think that again, this rise of China over the past couple of decades can genuinely be explicitly and in great detail confirmed by a lot of the names, dates, and connections that go back at the very least to the 1970s and the rise of the Deng Xiaoping era of the Chinese economy. Specifically, I locate a 1979 visit of Deng Xiaoping to the US, which was followed in June 1980 by a significant encounter between Rong Yiren of CITIC, a Chinese state investment firm, and David Rockefeller, where this meeting took place at Chase Manhattan Bank Complex. It was attended by 300 major U.S. corporation senior executives, and an agreement was reached between Chase, CITIC, and the Bank of China involving the exchange of specialists and technical personnel to identify and define those areas of the Chinese economy most susceptible to American technology and capital infusion. End quote. That comes from Towards Capitalist Restoration, Chinese Socialism After Mao. If people are looking for the reference, it's in my China and the New World Order podcast. But after that meeting specifically, Rong Yiren and David Rockefeller meeting at Chase Manhattan in June 1980, suddenly we see this huge influx of investment into China over the course of the 1980s and then picking up pace in the 1990s. An absolute who's who of the Fortune 500 CFR globalist jet set. Matsushita and HP and Microsoft and IBM and Lucent and all of these companies start flooding dollars into China, and not only in terms of manufacturing, but also in terms of R&D, which is a very different thing and not one that's easily explainable for economic reasons, other than the fact that they're planning to relocate all of their, not just their manufacturing, but all of their actual discovery, their research, their development over to China. That was taking place in the 80s and 90s. We start seeing the movement of headquarters towards Beijing. And suddenly, out of nowhere, in around 2000, suddenly the Chinese economic miracle starts to occur, and they start. No, it wasn't suddenly out of nowhere. It was part of a plan that's been taking place for decades and can be located at least as far back to that June 1980 meeting. And once we start to put those pieces into this puzzle, we start to understand why there is so much, and there has been so much preparation over the past few decades for specifically this moment of China's rising power.
And this is why the yuan is now being introduced into the basket of SDRs with the IMF. They're doing this to complete the transition at this point in time?
I absolutely think so. And I think that's one of the most important pieces of this. When you look at all of the rhetoric surrounding the AIIB, all you see is the AIIB itself, Beijing, all of its members, all of the people talking about it saying, this isn't actually challenging the IMF World Bank system. It's going to be a complement to that system. It's not going to revolutionize the world order. It's going to supplement the world order. They're saying it from their own mouths, and they're backing it up with their actions, like trying, as China has for the last decade and probably will, if not this year, then maybe 5 years from now when the next basket review comes up, will angle to get the yuan included in the SDR basket. And that's significant because, again, people talk about the yuan, maybe they're trying to back it with gold or whatever. Well, specifically, the Bank of China governor has been arguing for the past 6 years that they should be included in the IMF special drawing rights basket because they want to move towards the SDR as the world reserve currency, not the US dollar. What is the SDR for people who don't know? It is a convertible currency that can be held by central banks. It can be converted at the moment into dollars, yen, euros, and pounds. But every 5 years, the IMF looks at that basket and thinks, well, should we add this? Should we take out that? 5 years ago, they said the yuan wasn't ready to be added to that basket. It wasn't convertible enough. They are going to do another basket review later this year, and there's every indication that the yuan might be included this time, or at the very least next time. I'm sure at some point it will be. And I think that's the model towards which we're being moved. We're being moved to a world where it's not going to be the US dollar that's going to be the world reserve currency. It's going to be this basket. It's a multipolar world, and it has all of this flowery rhetoric that people like to hear about how, oh, it's going to be spread out all over. But of course, it's going to be the very same people at the very top who are connected in those types of agreements and secret meetings like the one in June 1980 and many, many others that could be documented. It's going to be those people that are going to still be in control of this. And of course, it's going to still look like it does today. People are still going to have dollars. People are still going to have yuan and yen and pesos and whatever. But behind the scenes, the central banks are going to be working with these SDRs, which are really just a type of globalized currency. And increasingly, we're going to see the move towards this multipolar world as part of a concerted effort to bring about this new world order.
So let me ask you, when this eventually does occur, what happens here in the United States? Your opinion, I mean, what will people see? I mean, will life go on as it is today and there's no problem? The Fed will still exist. They will still create money, or are we going to see a devaluation of everything and the way of life here in the United States is going to change?
Whether it will be a complete, sharp, hard crash or a more gradual landing, I'm not sure. I think it could potentially proceed either way, but I do know that things will not continue as they are today or in the manner that they are today. There will be a significant change that will take place over the next generation, certainly, over the next decade even. I would say there will be a documentable change that's going to start to occur because, once again, this new system cannot rise out of anything but the ashes of the old system. So I think that there has to be a destruction of the U.S. dominance of the world economy. And that destruction of the dominance of the US dollar is going to have effects on the US economy, obviously. I mean, the most obvious point will be the point at which the US dollar is eclipsed as a world reserve currency by what I imagine will be, if not the SDR, at least something like that, some sort of multi-currency basket or something along those lines, which I'm sure that will be introduced as the replacement for the US dollar. When that happens, obviously the US government can't continue to act as it has, printing the world's reserve currency. You can print as much as you want and everyone will lap up as much debt as you can possibly put out there. It will start to have significant effects on the US government and what it can do. But again, I think we have to differentiate between the oligarchy, which of course is very much infested in the US government, and the US government itself. Again, I don't think this oligarchy cares at all for the United States or the citizens of the United States, and I don't think they identify themselves with it. So if it means the destruction of the American way of life and the American economy as we've known it, I don't think they care about that, and I don't think that's what they're really concerned about.
Let me just switch over to what has been going on with these cyber attacks. We understand that the corporate media, the U.S. government, they're continually telling us that Russia is attacking. The last time we've heard that they attacked the White House. We understand North Korea allegedly attacked Sony. Why is this all happening? What's going on here?
What's going on here is the best question, because I don't believe for a moment at face value these types of unsourced, anonymous assertions of these attacks and where they're coming from, because that's all we're getting. If you look at the recent White House infiltration, supposedly by the Russians, it's interesting if you look at the actual origins of this story. So this actually apparently took place last October and was reported about at the time. It's only in the past month or so that CNN came out with inside U.S. government sources, who of course won't go on record and won't give their names and won't give any evidence, who are saying that it looks like it's sourcing to the Russians. And of course, no one in the State Department or anywhere else will go on record to say this, because then they might actually have to produce some evidence. Literally, if you go to the main story that CNN used to break this story, they say, quote, investigators found telltale codes and other markers that they believe point to hackers working for the Russian government. That is absolutely the most useless journalistic statement imaginable, and we've seen this entire idea spread around the world now that the Russians hacked the White House based on absolutely nothing. Zero evidence whatsoever. And I think this is significant because it does tie back to that Sony hack, which again was blamed on North Korea immediately, and of course all the headlines spread that around the world instantaneously, even though, of course, a lot of security experts came out to say, well, actually, there really is no evidence for this. And in fact, it's somewhat unlikely that North Korea did this. And all they're saying is that some of the IP addresses and some of the code related to the hack seem to be related to something that was once tied to an attack that might have come from North Korea, which, again, is absolutely meaningless, especially in a world where proxies exist, if nothing else, let alone all of the things that sophisticated hackers would be able to do in order to spoof their identities online. So again, all of this is meaningless, but it points to a new, I think, vector of false flag that's going to have more of an impact on world events in the near future, which is this idea that these completely unsourced, completely unverifiable statements can come from anonymous sources from within the government to blame whatever political enemy they want to blame for whatever incident they say took place. How do we even know there was an intrusion itself? I mean, we can't even take that for granted. All we have is the say-so of the government. We were hacked. It was the Russians. And this is really the perfect vector for a false flag, because you don't even have to stage an event. You don't even have to do anything. You just come out with an assertion, and suddenly the public is whipped into warlike fever. And that's, I think, exactly what's happening right now. And I think this is being trial ballooned at the moment. And we're going to see more of this in the future, because as we know, from insiders like Richard Clarke and others who have talked about the fact that there is an iPatriot Act, the cyber version of the Patriot Act that is on the shelf and ready to go in the event of an I-9/11. So all they need to do is declare I-9/11, and the online world will look very different the day after.
So when you say I-9/11, I mean, are you talking about hitting the financial infrastructure? Are you talking about hitting the electrical infrastructure? Is that what you're saying?
It would presumably be something of similar psychological significance, if not military and economic significance, as 9/11. So something that would be spectacular. And of course, I have no insight into what that might be. It could be any number of things, but certainly an attack on electrical infrastructure or an attack on the economy. We've already seen, of course, some of these bank cyber attacks that have been talked about. So there are any number of vectors, but it is interesting to note that that there have been examples of these types of attacks in the recent past. As I say, there was some bank cyber attacks recently, and there was another piece of this pie that I was just about to get to that has suddenly escaped my memory. So I will let you proceed with the next question.
Okay. So let me ask you, I mean, what is the reason for all of this? I mean, they're picking on Russia, they're picking on North Korea, even China. They said, there's, cyber espionage coming from China. Is this to provoke those countries into doing something, or is it to just pin it on them and make it look like they're doing it?
To be honest, I mean, I think we would have to be naive to imagine that every country in the world isn't attempting to hack into every other country in the world. I'm sure that does go on. And perhaps even sometimes there could even be, for example, the defenses let down. So if, someone is attempting to break into a system, all you have to do is take away the firewall or take away the security or not attempt to block up or patch up a problem that exists and let that attacking agent in, and then say, look, they attacked us, now we can go get them. So again, this can take place in any number of ways, just like in real life a false flag could. But that's the other thing that I was going to mention that I forgot about. It is interesting to note that that recently the New York Fed has been hiring personnel for its adjunct office in Chicago, because of the possibility of some sort of market disruption related to their operations to raise interest rates that are likely to take place later this year. They're starting to prepare, and supposedly they're giving out the official excuse that this is for the event of a potential natural disaster. But there are, again, unquoted, unverifiable, unnamed sources that are saying, well, actually, this could be for some sort of cyber attack of some sort that might take place during these sensitive market operations. So again, we could see that as a potential, at least something that could be used for the initiation of, who knows? I mean, again, in an event of something that has fundamental significance to the economy, it could be even something drastic, like the declaration that the government now has to wield its power in cyberspace, and the erstwhile neutral way in which the U.S. has ruled over ICANN and other institutions, which are supposedly international and everything, could very quickly become very much United States institutions run and operated by the U.S. government if and when they decide to do that.
And just to expand on that, isn't NORAD also moving or setting up something in Cheyenne Mountain? They're spending millions of dollars to refurbish it and to move back in there just in case something happens. And secondly, I just saw, and I reported on it, that the Treasury is going to be holding cash for the next year. And they're going to hold on to the cash just in case there's a natural disaster or something else. So I find it very interesting that all this is happening at once. Have you heard anything about that, or?
I haven't heard about that Treasury story. I had heard about the Cheyenne Mountain move with NATO, NORAD, but I don't have a lot of details on that. I think it's just another piece of what I think is a very interesting puzzle that's coming together right now that includes things like that New York Fed story and like the Cheyenne Mountain story and like the U.S. Treasury story holding cash, if that's what you're talking about. And there's other pieces to this as well. I mean, obviously people are focused right now on Jade Helm 2015 and these operations that are coming up in this summer and going through to September, and a lot of other things that are going on. Of course, the ammunition, buying millions of rounds of ammunition for all sorts of different departments and agencies that have been going on for years now, and that really paint an interesting picture. I think it's interesting because we've seen the mainstream trying to vilify people who actually prepare for natural disasters or whatever may come as preppers. Oh, these crazy preppers want to live in their little doomsday bunkers because they're crazy. Meanwhile, the federal government is going crazy at the moment trying to prepare for all sorts of potential natural disasters that may happen. And they all seem to be converging and coalescing on this window that we're moving through right now towards the end of the year. So I don't know. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but it is interesting to see all of these different things happening pretty much at the same time.
And since we're talking about the internet and cyber attacks, I noticed that online we're seeing more and more censoring, like antiwar.com with Google. We see that some YouTube channels are taken down, then brought back up for no apparent reason whatsoever. We see the FCC has now taken control of the internet, saying it's a utility now. I mean, where do you see this going with censoring people's rights and everything that's going on at this point?
Well, the FCC, that's a particularly worrying move because, of course, that's just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the declaration of some sort of new fairness doctrine online where suddenly you have to present, a government-approved opinion or something along those lines. It could be done, and again, maybe that's the type of thing that's included in that I-911, I-Patriot Act legislation that we obviously aren't allowed to see. Who knows? But perhaps even more insidious than that is the things that you're talking about with regards to, say, Google, of course, YouTube, GooTube, these types of websites, these types of platforms where so many people have really centralized themselves. The internet is about this great decentralization of power, great decentralization of control, but so many people have congregated in just a handful of websites, Google and Facebook and these types of places that we know and can document are in many different ways connected in with the U.S. intelligence agencies behind the scenes. Even a few years ago, there was a court order that came out to say that yes, Google and the NSA do have a relationship, but no, they are not. They are not required to discuss the details of that relationship. relationship to the court. So, so who knows what's going on behind the scenes? But we do know that there are ties like that, and have been since the very inception of some of these, like Google and Facebook and some of these other major platforms. And the type of censorship that they're capable of doing is even more insidious, because when you think of Google, of course, it's the window to the internet for most people. So they just type something into Google, and whatever comes up on the first page or maybe a couple of pages of results is generally all people are going to see. And we're seeing that now Google is explicitly adjusting their algorithm to take into account whether or not something is factual or deemed approvable by Google itself, I guess, the overlords at Google. They're starting to factor that into the search algorithms, which is going to have an effect on a lot of small businesses, small news sites, independent websites are going to be downgraded, and of course the mainstream old dinosaur media is all going to be upgraded as a result of this algorithm change. I think related to that, we're seeing all of the shenanigans with YouTube happening right now, where there has been a definite cut in viewership of alt media, various alt media YouTube channels that I've been watching. All happened around the same time. All drastically reduced viewing numbers, drastically, a lot of channels like We Are Change and others are now being demonetized so that they can't even make advertising revenue from their videos. I've never done that with Google and never will, because I don't want any of their money and don't trust them anyway. But I'm sure I think I did receive a message saying I was demonetized anyway. Well, it doesn't matter to me. But this is going on right now. And I think that's more insidious than outright U.S. government censorship, because at least if the U.S. government came out and started censoring set websites and saying you must present this viewpoint, at least people would see the tyranny. The great thing people said about the old Soviet propaganda was that no one believed it because everyone knew that it was fake. But in the worst part of the system we're under is that people at least believe there is this free flow of information. So if websites like Google and Facebook, which, by the way, was found to manipulate people's news feeds in an experiment to see if they could manipulate people's emotions, a bizarre story that came out, I believe, a year ago. We know these types of things are going on behind the scenes that they're actually letting on. What about the things they're not letting on, about the ways that they shape the search algorithms and what shows up in news feeds and things like that to shape people's perceptions? And that to me is really insidious. So I think that's something that the only real answer to that is to use the decentralization that is inherent in the internet to decentralize away from these mega platforms that they want us to congregate at. MySpace went the way of the dinosaur. I hope that Facebook and Google and all of these other big platforms will too, but it only will do so if we start taking the energy and lifeblood out of them by stopping to use these types of platforms.
I agree. I mean, I see on the internet, I see the companies, the government, I see they're continually not really out there monitoring where you can see them, but they're always behind the scenes doing something. And I've noticed, like, even on my channel, I've noticed strange things. It does occur. I mean, they brought my channel down at one time, and then I had people write in and they brought it back up. So I know things do happen. Things are happening right now. We see it around, we see it in France, where they're creating more draconian laws to take away the people's rights, to basically shut them up. We see in the UK, they're doing the same thing, where they're creating these laws. Of course, they're using terror, and they're taking away their rights. They're blocking websites just on their own. And basically, I feel the same thing is going to happen here, especially with the FCC at this point in time, because I think it was Pai, the commissioner of the FCC. He was out there saying that this net neutrality could lead into basically removing content or controlling the content. I mean, do you think it will head in that direction? I mean, I personally do.
I tend to believe that it will at some point. I think if they don't have to, then they won't. And as I say, I think that the sort of the self-censorship that goes on at Google and Facebook and things like that may be the easier way for them to function as tyrants without being seen as tyrants. But if push comes to shove, I'm sure they can and will use their declaration that the internet is now a public utility to now regulate it as such. And of course, in any way they see fit, by disallowing certain information or requiring certain information or what have you. So that is absolutely part of this, and it's part and parcel of all of these various ways that what people are doing and thinking and saying online are being manipulated and shunted off into certain pre-approved areas of acceptable opinion. And I think what we've seen is the explosion of suddenly millions, billions of voices and ideas coming together online in this free-form discussion that the internet enables. And right now they're trying to shape it back into that sort of controlled gatekeeper structure, which had worked so well for the oligarchy in the previous couple of centuries of mass media. I think they're trying to shape it back into that right now. And so they'll use any tool at their disposal in order to do that.
Now, I saw on your YouTube site, Corbett Report, something that struck me when you said something about subliminal messages for martial law. What do you mean by that? I mean, are they putting in different messages into commercials, or what exactly are they doing, and why are they doing this to convince us that martial law, I guess, is coming?
Why is only, I suppose, pure speculation on my part at this point. Okay. But the fact that they are doing it is not speculation. So this story comes from an interesting PSA that, as I understand, was actually released last year as part of an ad council public safety awareness message campaign about caregiving. And in this particular PSA, it's basically, it's the scene of a mother who's in a room knitting or something, and she hears her daughter crying in the bathroom or something, so she goes to take care of her, and they jump cut to 50 years later, and it's the mother who's now basically a grandmother and in the bathroom and has fallen and can't get up or something, and her daughter's coming to help basically take care of her. It's all about, roles change and blah, blah, blah. So it's a very innocuous kind of ad that you might see on the news or on TV at any given time. But the bizarre thing about it is that someone, after, I guess, a year or so of this being up online, so, however many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people had seen this ad over the course of its campaign, suddenly someone noticed if you absolutely crank the volume up as high as you can go and listen as closely as you can, you could just barely make out the fact that the person in the background is listening to it sounds just like radio babble, but when you really hone in on the audio, it's actually a message that says, riots nationwide have prompted local governments to declare martial law. The president is asking that citizens find safety and remain calm. Authorities are working to contain the outbreak. Meanwhile, you have this image of this mother smiling happily, knitting with her needlework. It's such a bizarre contrast that the interesting part about that to me is that type of message can't just randomly appear in something like this. For anyone who's worked with any media whatsoever, you know that audio layer of the background radio noise was inserted into that mixture, and obviously whoever did that knew what that message was saying. So it's really bizarre that particular message was inserted in there. And I don't have some grand theory about how the ad council and AARP were working together to try to, I don't know, inculcate this in the minds of people. I think it is an interesting piece of that puzzle, and maybe there are connections. I don't have anything provable, but I think it's just another example that we've seen in recent years of conditioning the general public mindset for the possibility of martial law, even the idea of martial law. I remember several years ago having to explain to any friend that I talked to about this subject what martial law was. I don't think I have to do that anymore. I think everyone has at least heard of this concept, understand this as a concept. This is when the military basically take over operations of the country and security, and suddenly you don't have police out on the streets, you have militarized, the actual military rolling around in tanks. And we're starting to see that happen more and more. We're starting to see things like the lockdown that occurred after the Boston bombing and things of that nature that is now being embedded in the public consciousness, and also through the media, not only things like that PSA I'm talking about, but through any number of movies that have come out in recent years depicting various stages of martial law. And I do an ongoing podcast called Film Literature in the New World Order, where I talk to various guests about interesting messaging that's contained in a lot of this cultural programming. And one of the ones that we looked at recently, just one example of this, was Outbreak. I believe that was the name of the movie. I'm glad I can't even remember the name of the movie. One of these conditioning for some sort of massive, Ebola type event or what have you that's going to come and kill millions of people, and so we all have to line up and get our shots. And of course, one of the iconic images of that is them trying to cross over the state line with millions of other cars and being prevented by the National Guard, the army that suddenly rolled in to take over control. And there are many, many examples of this in Hollywood in recent years. So I think there is, again, whether this is just sort of the zeitgeist that cultural workers are picking up on, or whether this is something that's being embedded in these types of scripts from behind the scenes through connections that we know the CIA has a Hollywood liaison officer and things like that. So who knows where these ideas are coming from, but they are being embedded, and now more and more people are being introduced to this idea of some sort of martial law takeover.
You think this is being linked into what is happening this summer with Jade Helm? I mean, we saw Walmart. All of a sudden they closed down. They said they had a plumbing problem. And of course it went off to that, no, it was getting back at some of the employees because they asked for a wage increase, but they closed all the Walmarts down in that same path of where Jade Helm is going to be held. And we see the Texas governor, very nervous about Jade Helm. He's going to have the National Guard watching. Do you think this is part of the conditioning to get us used to what is coming?
That, in some ways, would be, for me, I think, the scariest option of all of this. I mean, I know a lot of people are focused on the idea that this is going to be martial law. It is going to go hot this summer. And I'm sympathetic to those people who are caught up in that. I've certainly talked about this many times in the past on my podcast. I remember back in 2007, I was warning about various drills that were taking place. And, if this went live. So it could happen. And if it did, I'm sure that would be one thing. But perhaps more interesting is the idea that things like these are brought to the surface and perhaps encouraged out into the alternative media to be spread, again, as part of this martial law is coming, preparing the public consciousness for it. Because I think that's the real concept of predictive programming. People may have heard of this concept, but basically the idea is you are introduced to an idea over and over and over and over and over again through various forms of media that you watch. And of course, you're just taking in the media as it's just movies, it's just television, it's just things that you're watching on screens. It's not real. But by the time it finally gets to you, suddenly you're ready for it. Oh, well, of course this is going to happen. I've seen it happen a million times. And we can see that in all sorts of different ways. Perhaps a great example would be Minority Report, which was made, I can't even remember how many years ago, but a decade or so ago. And all of the technologies that were presented in that are starting to come true. And it's interesting. I've seen about at least, without even trying, I've seen at least a dozen, maybe 24 news stories over the years saying, well, this was we first saw this in Minority Report, and now it's here. All of these talking ads that are going to talk directly to you and blah, blah, blah. All of those technologies came true, not because Minority Report would sort of randomly stumbled on all of these great ideas, but because people might not know the filmmakers had an actual technology conference, including some of the best technologists in the world. They held this conference. They created this blue book. I think they called it the Future Bible or whatever they called it. I think Bible something. And this was basically their prediction of what the world would look like in 2086 or whatever, based on current trends. And so all of these technologies were thought through, and they were talked about how we will develop these types of technologies and blah, blah, blah. And now suddenly we start to see them coming online. That's an example of predictive programming. I think this martial law idea is, again, predictive programming. Again, we've seen it through a lot of the media sources that we're watching, movies and television and things like that. And now we're starting to see it, again, with the alternative media pushing this idea, martial law is coming, martial law is coming, martial law is coming, which in a way, in a sick way, might help, again, prepare the public for when martial law actually arrives. Because when it actually arrives and you see it on the streets and you say, well, we knew this was coming, and you're more resigned to the idea.
Well, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. If you're looking for something very interesting, go to his YouTube channel, go to CorbettReport.com, And definitely I'll put all the links at the bottom of this video and you can take a look at it. Do you have anything else you'd like to finish up with, or?
I think we've covered the gamut today, but thank you again for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for coming on.